All right, welcome back everyone to our fall speaker series. This is day 3 of our fall speaker series. Joined with me today is Phillip Hicks and Gavin Ross. If you guys would like to introduce yourself.
Sure, I'll go ahead and introduce myself. Yes, my name is Phillip Hicks. I live in Houston, Texas. I joined the ASP, or at least I first started voting for the ASP back in 2016. So I've been an avid fan of American Solidarity Party for a good while now. I am an engineer by trade, but I'm very fascinated in political philosophy, and especially this topic. I love having conversations with friends about why third parties matter. So very excited to be here, and yeah, looking forward to a great discussion.
All right, should I go?
Yeah.
Okay. My name is Gavin Ross. I'm from the state of Maryland, but right now I'm a student at Loyola Chicago. I'm a first-year student. I've first heard of the ASP, I think, around in 2020, and I've been following the party since then, slowly increasing my participation over the years, especially since I turned 18 and was able to become official member. And in June, I think it was, I was elected as a delegate to the National Convention. And this is also just an area that I'm really passionate about. I've tried to learn a lot about electoral reform, the effects of third parties, and really dispel a lot of the myths that the duopoly likes to throw at us.
Thank you, guys. And then I realized I never introduced myself. That's a little weird. I am a senior at the University of Illinois, a philosophy major. I became interested in the party a few years ago through Amar Patel, actually. And I now lead the chapter of the Young Americans for Solidarity at my school, the Illini Solidarians, we like to say. And yeah, and today we're going to be talking about why third parties matter. So,
hey, Will, before we get started, I just want to point out, Gavin, I recently read your post in the American Solidarity Party blog. And as I was reading it, I was like, man, this is really well written. A lot of good thoughts in here. And then I read the byline at the bottom saying that you were in high school at the time that you wrote it. And I was like, wow, that's impressive. I wish I had the wherewithal and the acumen to come up with that kind of like clarity of thought as a high schooler. And I also want to say I'm super stoked to be with younger guys like you in this discussion, because this is exactly what the party needs. So keep it coming.
Yeah, thank you so much.
All right. Well, we could jump right in with, I guess, the first question to pose to you guys. What good can third parties offer aside from, you see typically the concrete good of electing candidates or policy reform, at the very least, the immediate good, right? Because I don't think any of us are really voting for Peter Sonsky, really expecting, he's going to win this election. So yeah, I guess what good can third parties offer aside from that?
So, Gavin, if you don't mind, I'll jump in and tackle this one first. So, yeah, it's easy to think, well, okay, the purpose of voting is to elect candidates, which is a fallacy that I hope to dispel later. But that's maybe the way a lot of people think. And so if you think of voting or even forming a party strictly from the sense of the concrete objectives, which are important and we'll get to later. But if that's your only thought, then you miss, I think, some key areas where third parties can have a lot of influence. And I'll name 3 if you'll give me a few minutes to kind of enumerate those. The first one is the enhancement of public discourse. So this is probably something all people are aware of, the problem that we have with public discourse right now. We're a very polarized nation. We very much live within the rhetoric of either or. You either support this or you support this. There are only 2 possible options, 2 possible solutions to any problem. This is obviously fallacious, but why do we fall into this? I would argue that a big reason that we see this in our society is because of the 2-party system. If you look at, for example, the COVID pandemic was a big eye-opener for me, because I already knew that we had this polarization problem, but it was maybe not, I wasn't aware of how it even transcended politics. So something as apolitical as how we respond to a major pandemic very quickly became polarized into either you think that we need to kind of hunker down and isolate ourselves and I don't know, some people would say like ruin the economy. You're either in that camp or you're in the camp of we need to prioritize freedom over safety and wearing a mask is offensive to me. It was crazy to me how quickly we kind of polarized into those two extremes. And a lot of it had to do with the discourse that happened through our political channels, frankly, the two-party system. I think when you have a third party that has enough prominence to shift the discourse to, well, maybe there's another option out there, that's really important. And I think we can see a third party having a really important impact on our public discourse when it comes to everything from abortion to immigration to police reform. All of these issues are things that are complex, they're nuanced, they're not things that we're going to solve with an either or solution. And a third party is necessary, in my opinion, to get us to start talking about these other ways of thinking about problems. So I don't know, that's one reason. I've got a couple others, but I'll let I'll cede the floor to Gavin so he can, chime in on that.
Yeah, so even if like you are just really looking at what can I achieve concretely this election, the way that a lot of these election laws are written are that if you want to maintain ballot access or have access to public funding, then you need to cross a certain threshold, and that's usually fairly realistic for third parties. It depends on the state. I think public FEC funding is 5%, which may be a little more of an ask, but a lot of states require 1% either for the president race or the gubernatorial race, just to maintain ballot access. And a common criticism that is levied against third parties is that like we don't care enough about local elections. And while I think it is very true that we need to do more about local elections across the board, the fact is that these systems are written such that they force third parties to run for races that we cannot win. But we sort of like quote unquote win those races or win our objectives there if we can cross generally 1% and can maintain our ballot access and are able to run candidates down ballot.
Yeah, so like there's something of almost like winning even just by being there is like that itself is a victory for a third party. One more thing I wanted to say, everyone. I realized I forgotten to say this in the beginning, but we will actually be taking audience questions. So if you guys are interested, comment in whatever you're watching this on, whatever platform, and we'll be going through it, and we might ask your question. So yeah.
Let me jump in on that last point, because you were mentioning how even the existence on the ballot itself is a victory. And again, I would say that's also true from this kind of intangible goods perspective. Another reason that I think it's important for third parties to be there, even if they're not winning the votes, is the awareness that they raise to issues that aren't paid attention to otherwise. Or even education about political philosophy. So for example, in my own past, I became dissatisfied with the two-party system pretty early on in my voting career. And so starting to look for alternatives, at the time that I started looking, the American Solidarity Party wasn't around quite yet. I looked into the Libertarian Party. And I ultimately decided that, yeah, this philosophy is not for me. This doesn't kind of encapsulate what I believe. But what it did, the very existence of the Libertarian Party prompted me to come to terms with what I thought about government involvement in our everyday public life. And so even though I ultimately didn't come to the same conclusions as the Libertarian Party comes to, I at least had to grapple with the questions that they raise. And so that's something that I think the American Solidarity Party is really starting to challenge people on, is pointing out that, hey, there's another way of looking at these things, whether it's through the lens of Catholic social teaching, Christian ethics, or just kind of moderate politics. We are, I think, prompting people to understand another way of thinking about politics, and that's critical regardless of whether or not we're even on the ballot. So I would say that's another reason. One more that I want to bring up is the ability to discuss issues within the context of Catholic social teaching, or even just within the context of like-minded people. I'm going to give you an example. In the 2020 American Solidarity Party, I'm sorry, in the presidential primary for this election, we held that, I think it was in 2023. We had to do the primary well in advance so that we could get candidates' names on the ballots. During that primary, I was really pleased to hear a lot of discussion of how Catholic social teaching applies to political problems. So an example was, there was one question that raised question that raised the discussion of how subsidiarity applies to care for the environment. Think about that for a second. How subsidiarity applies to care for the environment. Would you ever expect that topic to come up in one of the major parties? But what a shame, right? Because that's two key ideas within Catholic social teaching that need to be discussed, and they're not being discussed by the major parties because they don't have the vocabulary for them. So there's a lot that can be gained just from the existence of a third party, especially one like the American Solidarity Party.
Yeah, I think especially, honestly, like, just for our mental well-being, knowing that there are other people who share our values. And I think a lot of people, like millions of Americans, I think actually do share our values to a large extent. It's just the fact that, you hear so much about, I'm fiscally conservative but socially liberal. Nobody really says the opposite other than us. So it pretty much is on us, like, to raise that into the public consciousness. But also, I think being on the ballot is, like, an incredibly important thing, because you see a lot of news agencies will start to feel bad if they totally ignore third-party candidates if they're on the ballot, and they might give you, like, a cursory shout-out. But if you're a write-in candidate, yeah, you pretty much get nothing.
Yeah, I think that's certainly true. I think just like the sort of visible aspect to it, of providing that sort of unifying, and not just unifying, but I think, like, as you guys talked about, there's really sort of a destruction of discourse, I think, that happens with the two-party system. And I mean, that was a wonderful example, Philip, of that's a perfect example, I think, of something that just could not be, you just couldn't express that in either of the two. And so I wanted to ask you guys, do you guys think that there's just something intrinsic in the two-party system of, unless, like, which is to say without third parties, that sort of funnels people to both, decrease the discourse that we could have. So like something like that would just never be talked about, but also to, as you said, politicize things that maybe don't need to be super political. Like in the case of the COVID thing, it was like, if you were Republican, you believe this. If you're a Democrat, you believe this. And even if you're someone who inclines to agree with, say, the Republicans on most things or the Democrats on most things, but your party still, this is the official position. Do you think that there's sort of like this mechanistically, not just like culturally, but do you think there's a mechanism that actually drives people into pigeonholed into just the two options?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's cultural and mechanistic. I kind of like that word, kind of institutionalized. From the cultural perspective, I think we also have to look at how modern society has changed a lot, especially in the last 20 years. I'm a big proponent of kind of I don't know. My friends probably think of me as a Luddite because I haven't bought into the whole like smartphone culture. I think we do have to be aware of how our technology influences the way we engage in public discourse. We have now the ability to go online thinking that when we're online, we are going to be exposed to the whole breadth of viewpoints throughout the world. But we know that that's not the case, that, the algorithm is deciding essentially what we're going to see based on what it determines we are going to be interested in. So our culture and our technology do kind of drive us into these polarized camps. But from the perspective of, is there some like kind of institutional mechanistic drive behind this? I would say yes. If you look at the presidential primary process that we go through, when the candidates are campaigning in the primaries, they're trying to appeal to the party base. They're not trying to appeal to Americans broadly, because they want to get the vote of, if you're a Republican campaigning during the Republican primaries, you're campaigning toward Republicans. And so if you end up shifting, if you feel that there is a faction of the party that is shifted right, you are likely to shift your own rhetoric to the right to attract those voters. Very rarely do you see a presidential primary shifting candidates center. That I haven't seen that in my adult life, and that's problematic. And this is institutionalized in the sense that in order to vote in a Republican primary, I have to be registered as a Republican. At least that's the case in most states. Similarly with Democrats. And so the primary system is geared to give us candidates that are on not necessarily the extremes, but that are driven toward the extremes in order to satisfy those wings of the party. I think we've seen that a lot in the last 3 election cycles. And that's not, I don't think that's coincidental. I think that's kind of baked into the system.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing is, are they even shifting to the middle anymore is my question. I think we're seeing less and less of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's a shame, because most Americans, or at least a plurality of Americans based on polls, consider themselves moderates. Mm-hmm. And also the majority of Americans consider themselves unaffiliated with a major party. So we're not satisfying the vast majority of the electorate by this process.
Yeah, for the first time in several decades, there are more independents than Democrats, and there are more independents than Republicans. And I've told that to some of my friends, and they're just like completely floored by this information. It's, I think like 43% are independents, the big parties have like 40% each. So it's not like a huge lead, but I think especially if you have so many people who are willing to declare themselves independents, like not just to polling organizations, but to the state, knowing full well that doing so means that they can no longer vote in partisan primaries, I think really just speaks to the level of dissatisfaction that people have with the current system. And they're saying, often these people do turn out and they vote on election day. It's not like they're just like disengaged from politics as a whole, but they're really disaffected from the system. And they're saying, neither party has any person who I would really want to vote for.
Yeah, and on that, I also read in I think it was a 2023 Gallup poll, or maybe it was from earlier this year, the 43% independent. And some might think, well, oh, okay, but maybe those are just the kind of crackpot, like really super, conservative or liberal. But that same poll also found that 36% of Americans consider themselves moderate. And of those who do favor either party, many of them don't favor them strongly. So there's a large group of the American electorate. It's hard to say exactly how much, but there's a sizable group that are not satisfied with the two parties.
Yeah, I mean, I think like the fact that we're seeing so many people, I think I read something like 60%. So like at least over 50% of Americans would say that they would be willing to vote for a third party. But it's like there's this sort of sense that like, oh, you just can't do that. It's not really, you can't really do that. And I wanted to, I feel like this is a pretty decent transition, unless you guys want to talk, if you guys had more thoughts about this to share. I wanted to ask you guys what role you think voting systems play in creating something like a two-party system or like a multi-party system. If you guys wanted to, if you have a few more things to say about this, please don't hesitate to do that. But to me, it just seems like it's a fair transition into that.
Yeah, I'm ready to move on. And I'm pretty sure that based on reading his post, Gavin has some good things to say about this. So I'm going to let him go first on this one.
Yeah, so I think I mentioned this in this post. I've mentioned it somewhere, but I think there are really like two big factors as to why we have a two-party system and very few other places do. The first, which like everyone loves to talk about, is voting systems and how can we change the voting system, and I think that's hugely important. But then the second is we have this like Anglo-descended political culture, and for whatever reason, like the English mind just loves two political parties. And you see this in the United States, in Canada, in Australia, New Zealand, and most of the English Caribbean. And most of the English Caribbean is where the other two-party democratic systems are. So I think, you know, in another system where even under first past the post or 2-round system, they're still voting for third parties, I think something like ranked choice voting could like conceivably lead to more third parties. But I think in a system, in a political culture like ours, that's simply just not true. And you saw that with Australia in 1919, like when they switched to ranked choice voting, their political system was kind of a mess. So you did have new parties propping up left and right. But ranked choice voting didn't do anything to make more parties. It just kind of kept the status quo until it eventually calmed down, and they coalesced into 2 major parties. And it's a de facto 2-party system now, even if smaller parties can occasionally win, which is true in the United Kingdom, which uses first past the post. So I really think we need something like proportional representation, like the type that they have in Europe, to really like sort of break the hold that that the 2-party system has on our political culture. And I think you saw similar things, like I think in Chile, they used to have a pretty strong 2-party system, but they eventually adopted proportional representation for both chambers of their Congress, which works pretty similar to ours. And now you have, you know, a whole host of parties that can win elections and even maybe the presidency. But I think for now, we should just focus on what system can get at least a few people from other parties elected to Congress and state houses, which I don't, to my knowledge, there's not any organization like advocating for electing legislative chambers by proportional representation as opposed to like fair vote, which is huge. Not that I think ranked choice voting is bad. I just think it's like not that much of an improvement. So if I want to focus my efforts on changing the voting system, I would rather focus it on doing something that like will have a noticeable effect. And I think this is really one of those issues where, again, third parties are the only ones who will bring up this issue. So if we can get some sort of third-party consensus on how do we switch to proportional representation systems, I think that would be good. But the second problem I think we have with the voting reform thing is I see comments like under the ASP or other parties every day saying like, you know, I really like you, and if we had ranked choice voting, I'd vote for you. But under this current system, I just can't, and I have to vote for one of the big parties. You're not going to get voting reform by voting for the big parties, especially when you say, once you change the system, I'm going to stop voting for you. That's just not how that works. So you need something like what happened in New Zealand, where so many people started voting for third parties, mostly one, the Social Credit Party, that like they were regularly getting 20% of the popular vote and, you know, 1-2 seats in parliament at best. And that was really the onus for the bigger parties to say, okay, this isn't working, let's switch to proportional representation. And now you have a system where like lots of parties can get elected to parliament based on, you know, if I think their threshold is 5%. So if 5% of the population votes for you, you get 5% of the seats. So I think that is really the only time-tested way that a political culture similar to ours can transition to a multi-party system.
Yeah, I'll just jump in and say that I'm a big proponent of ranked choice voting. I agree that it may not be what's required to get third parties into the office, but it may be what's required to get them into the limelight, so to speak. And I would be pretty pleased about that. Maybe it's worth just kind of giving a brief explanation of what ranked choice voting is, because I'm not sure for people who haven't been with the ASP for a while, or maybe for the older generation, the idea of ranked choice voting is maybe something that's kind of mind blowing. So Gavin, I'll let you, maybe jump in and correct me. Mm-hmm. But essentially, ranked choice voting is where when you vote, you're not just, if you have a list of candidates, you're not just voting for one, you're voting for them in rank order. And what that allows you to do is, there are a couple different systems for how ranked choice voting could work, but what that allows is for you to vote for who you really like the best, and then basically identify who you would like as a second place in case your candidate doesn't win. And so that would really help to dispel this idea of the wasted vote, because a lot of times they say they're voting strategically, meaning that I'll vote for a third party if I know that I'm in a state whose electoral votes are going to go to a certain candidate anyway. but not in the case. I won't vote for a third party in the case that the race is close. So ranked choice voting kind of gets rid of that concern because it gets rid of the spoiler concern that so many people are worried about when they say that they don't want to waste their vote for a third party candidate. Now, I am going to hopefully have a chance to identify that as a fallacy in the first place, but I'll give Gavin a chance to maybe jump in on kind of the structure of ranked choice voting.
I mean, yeah, all that's correct. And I should clarify, like, I don't think ranked choice voting is bad. I'm not opposed to it. All I said was, like, I don't think it will necessarily get more third parties elected. Yeah. I do agree it could improve at least, like, the amount of attention that we get a lot. And frankly, it's better on its other merits than first past the post, regardless. But I mean, I can attempt to explain proportional representation if you want, which is kind of a pain to understand, I think.
I don't know if I think that would be helpful if you don't mind us going down that rabbit hole, Will.
Yeah, no, I was going to ask if you could actually do that, because I think that'd be helpful for all of our understanding, specifically of what exactly we're talking about. So yeah, please do, Gavin.
Yeah, so I mean, there are a few like ways of doing this, mechanisms of doing this, which I won't get into because it's already sort of like hideously complicated as it is. Or maybe it only feels that way because, again, there's no like organization that's really trying to simplify this. So I basically had to learn things about proportional representation from like election nerds who are not the best people at simplifying this kind of information. But firstly, I just like to preface, don't be too scared because like the majority of the world's countries use this. They can figure it out just fine. So it's not like intrinsically complicated. But how it works is that you vote for a political party. You say, like, here are all the parties that are running. Which one would you like to see represented? And then if that party gets, say, 5% of the votes, then 5% of the seats in that legislative body will go to that party, generally based on, like, each party has a list of people who they would elect in order. And you can also do this by having, like, multi-member districts, and you rank each people like in the multi-member districts, and the difference between that and like quote-unquote ranked choice voting, even though they're both ranked, is that ranked choice voting here usually means like single winner districts, whereas in Ireland they have multi-winner districts, and this is how we elect our delegates in the ASP, for example. But I think like America, we kind of like our single winner districts, and that's compatible with the proportional representation system of like the list type. So hopefully that explains it.
I think that makes sense to me, at the very least. But yeah, I don't know, Philip, what did you think?
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. And I agree that there's no particular reason why proportional representation wouldn't work in America. It's just not what we're used to. It's not kind of historically what we've used. And so it would certainly take some like societal relearning, I think. But, you know, as Gavin pointed out, most democracies in the world use this system, and they've found a way to make it work. I think when we talk about kind of institutional reasons why third parties don't necessarily attract as much of a following, or I don't know, had we gotten to that question? I think you were asking about kind of mechanistic things, right? So would this be a good time to talk about like winner take all in the Electoral College and federal funding for campaigns and things like that?
Yeah. Actually, I think it would be. There's a few more like related questions.
Yeah.
One of them was actually, if you don't mind me asking first, I had a specific question actually about historical examples of third parties taking over, because I think that, you know, we absolutely can and should talk about like, okay, how are we actually going to do this? But I'm a big believer that informing our sort of plan based off of like history, you know, if someone did it before, then we might not need to reinvent the wheel, so to speak. So yeah, I just wanted to ask, like, and I know Gavin briefly touched on that, but are there any historical examples of third parties taking over, or that you think would be relevant to our political sort of scene? And and just describe a little bit about that and how they did it. I guess.
Yeah. So when you say third parties taking over, that maybe is a bit of a
I should say I don't mean
misstatement,
taking
but
over as in like
having impact, right? Like having a
impact.
significant influence on things.
Yeah, and the reason why I actually I miswrote that question. I thought actually earlier about like, well, there's really no party, you know, in a republic at least that really can always take over unless there was a sort of, you know, the general belief system of the people tends to shift towards. But even then, like you'd want a healthy, like that party. Let's say one party gets elected and becomes a sort of universal, you know, party. That party should break up then to sort of deal with the various different perspectives that could be even within that perspective. So let's say everyone in America just like, I believe in Christian democracy. Like this is what we want. Even then, I would argue that I think it would be healthy for it to have a multi-party system where, you know, various perspectives on how that could be done. But I think, yeah, when I say everyone who believes in a belief system and who votes for a party wants their, you know, perspective to kind of to win, to have an impact, as you said, and knowing that we don't want to set the bar too high, right? Not even the Republicans and the Democrats really truly can take over, so to speak. So. Yeah. Actually, we have a comment from.
So I just saw a comment pop up. Yeah, I'll address that real quickly because my first example was going to be the antebellum minor parties. Yeah, we had a comment popping up talking about Republicans. It was Dems and Whigs before, and then came Lincoln. So, yeah, the history of that period is pretty complex. I'm gonna hit it in really broad strokes, and I'm just an amateur when it comes to history, but it's an area of interest, especially when it comes to third party politics. So, look at pre-Civil War politics and political parties. Let's start with the Whigs and the Democrats were the two major parties at the time. A lot of us, maybe unless we've recently studied American history, don't even remember the Whigs. That's how entrenched the Republican Democratic two-party system has become. But at the time, it was the Whigs and the Democrats. Neither of those parties was addressing the topic of slavery, at least not in an adequate way to anyone who would consider themselves an abolitionist. The abolitionist movement was not satisfied with what they were seeing from the major two parties. And so despite the fact that, you know, the movement started out really kind of apolitical, trying to change hearts and minds. William Lloyd Garrison actually didn't like the idea of politics. But eventually the abolitionist movement kind of coalesced into the Liberty Party in the 1840s. They ran a campaign in 1840. They weren't well organized. They won less than 1% of the vote. Wasn't very effective. But then in 1844, they ran again, more organized campaign. They had a candidate who was a little bit more well-known. They got only 2.7% of the vote nationally. But in the state of New York, they took enough votes from the Whigs to turn the tides and give the state of New York to Polk. And the Whigs were really upset by this. This was a spoiler. It was the first spoiler in the history of the country, and that a lot of people would say, well, that was a problem. You know, Henry Clay, the Whig, would have been better than the Democrat Polk. But if you look at it, what happened in that election was because the Liberty Party stole those votes from Henry Clay, slavery became an issue that had to be addressed. People had to start thinking about it. And they realized that they could no longer ignore it. And so from there, you had the formation of the Free Soil Party. Eventually, when the Whigs collapsed, a lot of those members moved into the Republican Party. And by the time the Republican Party formed in the 1850s, slavery was like the anti-slavery movement was a key plank in the party. And you see that when Lincoln won the election in 1860, it was, you know, much to the chagrin of the Southern Democrats, but he won the election largely on the basis of the anti-slavery plank in the platform. And so that's a huge one, because what you can see, the lesson that we can take from that is that a party doesn't have to be big and successful in electing candidates in order to have a substantial influence on politics. the fact that the abolitionist movement gained traction within the political sphere was the result of less than 3% of the vote nationally. So that's a big deal. That can give you a lot of hope to the idea that you don't have to be huge and powerful to have an influence. Another one, when we talk about people feeling powerless and then forming a kind of a coalition around that, is if you look at the farmer and labor reforms of the late 1800s and early 1900s, where this is another complicated one that I'm going to brush over in real broad strokes. But you had the greenbacks kind of eventually morphed into the populists, and then a lot of those sentiments got picked up by the Progressive Party in the early 1900s. Never was there a president from any of those three parties. Someone pointed out in the comments, Teddy Roosevelt kind of came close. I guess he got, I think, over 20% of the popular vote in 1912, but didn't ever elect a president. There were a number of congressmen elected under both the Greenback Party and the Populist Party, but a lot of the influence that they had was on bringing forward reforms in their platforms that eventually got picked up and put into law. A lot of these things are things that we take for granted. Like, you know, until going back and reviewing this history, I had forgotten the fact that we didn't directly elect senators until 1913. I think was when the 17th Amendment, I believe it was, came about, and so that was a big push from that movement, the farmer labor movement, to directly elect senators. Other things like the 8-hour workday, prohibitions against child labor. Let's see. I'm leaving off some important ones here, but like safe conditions in mines and factories, like the advocacy of safe working conditions, women's suffrage with the Progressive Party. So like all of these things started out with small movements that eventually gained some traction because these political parties brought these ideas, these necessary reforms to the political to the political sphere, to the national attention, and not ever by electing a president, and in some cases not even by electing members at all, just by their presence and their advocacy for these policies.
Yeah, I think like certainly across the world there are lots of examples of smaller parties becoming bigger parties, like that take place within the context of a system that already has a lot of parties, and I think that makes it easier. So if you just want to look at like you have a two-party system and then all of a sudden there are more parties, I think either what happens is like the system ceases to be, well, I think literally the only logical possible options are actually like either the system ceases to become a two-party system, or one of the major parties like collapses and another one takes its place, or one of the major parties adopts the positions of a minor party. Or I guess like what's happening in Argentina and El Salvador is like things just get so bad that like everybody joins this new like third party, and then we'll see how it goes for them. I think it's too early to tell. But yeah, everything I said that Phillip said about the Populist Party, I would agree with. You know, they left a huge impact on our political culture, and that was largely through the fact that they rose the prominence of these ideas such that there were Democrats like Bryan and Republicans like Roosevelt who were, you know, adopted these into their platform. So, which, yeah, I would love to see, you know, either of the big parties become a Christian Democratic Party, but I'm not entirely sure that's going to happen, or if that is like even what we should shoot for long term. But right now I'm just trying to think of like situations in which a two-party system became more of a multi-party system. And I mean, I think like you could look around in a lot of different places for that, but my mind is going to Latin America because they have systems that are similar to ours, and I think Chile is the best example because like the Christian Democrats were this sort of insurgent party that took over a lot of the votes from the old conservative party by like retaining most of the conservative voter base while also attracting like working class people and people who were usually pretty religious, but also didn't like the conservative party's sort of elitist policies while also opposing the anti-clerical party policies of the left-wing parties. So, you did have sort of a three-party-ish system emerge in Chile for a while, but then there was obviously like a coup and a very long military dictatorship after that. So that just sort of, did a lot of bad things, but for our purposes also messed up the sort of political calculus of having multiple parties, such that when democracy was restored, you had a bunch of people saying like, we're going to be the next big party, and we are, and eventually that caused more of the multi-party system. But yeah, other than the examples that were brought up, I'm not entirely sure if I could think of like a situation that would necessarily be applicable to us.
Yeah, I'll give you a couple other ones, and these are ones where it wasn't necessarily parties that were long-standing or robust with kind of a large grassroots base, but just a few quick ones off the top of my head. 1948 election between Truman and Dewey. There was kind of a splinter in the Democrat Party with Henry Wallace, who basically thought that the civil rights issue, the labor issue, and also foreign policy, it was a lot of foreign policy issues, weren't being treated adequately by Truman's platform. And it was largely in response to the formation of this third party that splintered off of the Democrat Party that Truman instituted he changed his rhetoric about civil rights. He vetoed the Taft-Hartley Act, which was universally hated by the labor movement. And so by doing those things, he kind of undercut the support from Henry Wallace. Henry Wallace only got, I forget, it was a very small percentage of the popular vote. And so maybe looking back on that, you would say, oh, well, yeah, Henry Wallace failed. All right. But no, I think what you can see is that he was successful in transforming one of the major parties to kind of take into account the platform positions that he was going after. So that's another example. Ross Perot is an example, not necessarily third party, but in 1992 he ran as an independent. His big push was to balance the budget. This was an issue that again wasn't being paid attention to. He was also, I mean, he also had a lot to say about kind of cronyism with like corporate America and stuff, but his big emphasis was we got to balance the budget. He originally was polling around 40%, which I think was higher than either of the other two candidates. And had it not been for some kind of weird, kind of like funny personal things that he did, like dropping out of the campaign for a long period of time, he may have been more successful. He still ended up getting close to 20% of the popular vote. But the key thing that he influenced there was his shining a spotlight on the importance of balancing the budget. And Bill Clinton, who won the election, if he had not made balancing the budget kind of a key issue for him, then he would have lost a lot of popular support. So I don't know. There are a number of examples of third parties having influence whether or not they actually won elections. And so I think there's a lot that we can learn from that history.
Wonderful. Thank you, guys. Yeah, I mean, and I think like that's reassuring to think that, even before we answer the question of, can we be a viable party on our own, in the sense of what I mean by that, in the sense of becoming, or what am I trying to say? Instead of just moving one of the two major parties, we could, what am I trying to say? Like, it's reassuring to know that even without, I don't want to say take over, that's why I'm like hesitant, even without becoming sort of one of the more major parties, even without having influence by like electing our people directly, we can still move the other parties towards really our belief system. That is a very comforting thing to know. But I think it's
yeah. No, I would like to see us kind of get in some local elections with some gusto and get some of this grassroots stuff going at the local level. I'm encouraged that over the past couple of election cycles, more and more ASP candidates have been running in state elections. and also definitely local elections as well. And so seeing more of that is going to kind of, I think, transition our ability to have more tangible influence, maybe is a way of saying it, where we're actually electing people. So
yeah, we're like the party itself actually gains power and then is able to do things with that. Yeah, I guess that this is a good time to ask this question then. And I would like to actually, I have some questions about specifically the local involvement. And then I also want to get to a certain question of working with an objection that one might have of working with one of the major parties. But before we do that, I want to ask you guys, what is your answer? Do you say that third parties are viable in the sense that we can actually gain power and that we're not just going to be like a spoiler effect or just, affect one of the major parties kind of indirectly? But do you guys see it to be possible for us to actually be able to gain political power, gain seats, gain, offices and do things with that? And if so, how?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it really starts at the local level. I think this very much is a grassroots movement. That's one of the reasons I love it. And so you got to start small. I think that happens by really engaging at the local level, and something I would like to see more of, and hopefully I'll have an opportunity to be a part of, is getting more people together in the city of Houston, say, and kind of rallying around our common cause of what the ASP stands for. And I think strategically for the ASP, we're going to have to identify those districts where there is kind of a strong presence of the ASP and where there's strong support, and go after, really go all in on those elections. And the more that we get people elected to the state legislature, or I don't know, the local, even smaller politics, the more we make a name for ourselves, and then the more people start to recognize the ASP as a viable party. If we maybe get a chance to talk later about some of the fallacies of wasting a vote, a lot of it has to do with this self-fulfilling prophecy of, well, I don't want to vote for the ASP because they don't have a chance of winning. Well, if we can show people that, no, we actually do have a chance of winning. Look at this state legislature spot over here. We won that. Then that helps to dispel that myth and that fallacy of not wanting to vote ASP in maybe their local elections or elections at a state or federal level.
Yeah, I think there are like two sort of ways that you could go about this, which ironically are like sort of the exact opposite of each other. One of them is to like run in an election that's going to be pretty close, and that way, and force it into a three-way race, and that way you only really need like 33% to win, which is what Jesse Ventura did in Minnesota. Whereas the other thing you could do is find races that are uncontested and run in them. But that's not all that is, because like, you could run against like a really popular incumbent who nobody is running against him for a reason. And yeah, we could get like 20-25%, but when that's against only one other person that's doing much, what you would have to do is what the Libertarian Party briefly did. I think they called it the Frontier Project, where they looked at like state legislative and local races, not only which were uncontested, but where like the general sort of like political climate was more amenable to libertarianism. And they got a guy elected against an unopposed Democrat in Wyoming to the state legislature. Unfortunately, they like basically refused to fund him in the next cycle because they were like, we're spending too much money for one state leg seat, and he didn't win re-election, unfortunately. So I think that really goes to show that if we want to win elections, we need to put in continual work to make sure that it's not just a one and done, and that we can really sort of like establish these deep roots in the community. But I think both of these strategies, we need to look at where is the political climate most amenable to the ASP? And not that I don't think we should run in other places. I think we should run as often as we can. But if we're looking at where do we like want to direct more resources, I think we would need to find places just where like the general political climate is more amenable to our values. And I have some like guesses as to where those would be, but I'm not entirely sure.
I think for sure. I mean, if I could comment briefly on what Gavin just said, I've certainly seen that as even just at such a small level as me trying to get some of my fellow Illini to be interested in our RSO. I've found that, you have I mean, like it or not, we have a limited amount of resources. We really don't have, an unlimited, we can just reach every single person. If we could reach every single person, we would. But if we have to concentrate on like specific groups, it is absolutely wise and strategic to look for those groups that are most likely to respond to our perspective and be open to that. But so we talked about a few ideas, right? We talked about like the local level, and I do want to explore that more, and I promise we will. I just want to make sure we cover everything. But what do you guys think about the idea of like sort of multi-third party coalition, so to speak, as well as people who are maybe in the Democratic Party or the Republican Party and are not super satisfied with just two options? If there is some way to sort of transition to a different voting system that enables, and I know we talked about like part of the way that we do that is through just supporting third parties anyway. I believe, Philip, I think it was you that suggested that if we just say, well, I'll vote for the ASP once the voting system changes. Well, if we do that, then exactly as you said, we're just incentive. Like, of course, the Republicans and the Democrats aren't going to change the voting system because that they're losing. They have an incentive to keep it the way it is so that you stay. But and so supporting the third party can actually help towards ultimately changing the voting system. As I believe you used a historical example where like 20% of the vote went to a third party before the voting system was changed. But yeah, I guess I just want to explore that briefly a little bit more before we move on to the local sort of local elections route. Do you guys, if you want to comment on that at all, of forming some kind of coalition to just sort of break up the power of the two?
Yeah, that's interesting. I would have to think about that harder, but I think the idea of a coalition of third parties to push for reform of the voting system, the electoral process, et cetera, is a good idea. If it's a matter of supporting a third party candidate with your vote, if that third party candidate is other than the ASP and is maybe of a party that kind of isn't aligned with our values, that's one where I would have a harder time buying into that because of the importance of what your vote signifies. If there were a candidate that was that was running on a campaign that was very heavily focused on campaign reform and voting reform, that would maybe change my mind a little bit. But if it was just a matter of just supporting a third party candidate with your vote, just from the perspective of kind of breaking up the two-party system, I would maybe be more careful about that. I don't know. That's a good discussion that you might have to look at the particulars of the situation.
Well, I would say I would like to add that doesn't mean just supporting any old third party. I think it means particularly supporting your third party as like the number one way that you would do that.
Yeah. Absolutely right.
Yeah.
So I mean, what Gavin was pointing out earlier is the kind of insanity of wanting a different system but continuing to vote for the existing system. If you vote Democrat or Republican, guess what you're going to get next election? Democrat and Republican. If you say to yourself, yeah, I'll vote for the ASP next time when it's not when the election doesn't have much at stake. Well, give me a break. These elections are always going to have serious things at stake. And so if we limit ourselves to voting for ASP when it doesn't matter, it's never going to not matter. Your vote always matters. And so you should be voting principle from day one. And if you want to see choices other than Democrat and Republican, you've got to vote something other than Democrat and Republican. If you want to see the ASP be successful, you got to vote ASP and donate to the campaigns too.
Yeah, and I think like if you only vote third party on elections that like even the big parties will concede just aren't important, like that means that they just don't care about them at all. So like what's that realistically going to accomplish? Like if you're one of those people who's like, ha ha ha, it would be funny to write my dog in for a position, then like sure, fine, whatever. Like write in your dog for like a county judge position that's like everyone knows what's going to happen and nobody really cares. But if we're talking about like voting for serious candidates who are proposing serious reforms to the system, then yeah, I think the greater, more important the election is, that's more incentive to vote third party, not less. And if we're talking about coalitions, I think there are like two ways people mean this. There's like in the electoral sense and on the issue-based sense. And I would hope that it's not super controversial on the issue-based sense, that like two third parties who agree with each other on one issue would work together on that issue. That seems to me pretty obvious. I think in reality it may be less obvious just knowing some of these parties, but I think the way I interpreted the question was more in an electoral sense, and like I certainly think third parties should be coordinating electoral efforts, but what I don't think we should be doing is trying to say like third parties will agree on one candidate in each district and not run against each other. And I think there are sort of two reasons why this doesn't work, or maybe they're the same reason, I'm not entirely sure. But like no matter what the party central committees agree to, like you're just not going to get that many libertarians to vote for us, and you're not going to get that many of us to vote for libertarians. Like that's just not really a thing that most of us want to do. Like third party voters are already like pretty stubborn if they're willing to go that far. So saying like, okay, you just have to vote for a different candidate who you don't agree with, I don't think that would do that much. And I think also it's actually just more effective if you try to run as many third-party candidates in a district as possible, because what that does is it brings up the total third-party vote. And I think bringing up the total third-party vote, no matter whether it's coalesced or one party or not, is what is going to get the bigger parties to say like, hey, there are a lot of people whose voices aren't being heard. And that can be bad for us in the long term, because I don't like the benefit of running multiple third parties is, sure, you won't coalesce all of the third party vote, which I don't think you could anyway, but even if you could, the fact is that there are going to be independent voters who probably would consider voting for one of the bigger parties, but not if like there is a party that really appeals to them. So I think making sure that all of us have the opportunity to be on as many ballots as possible is where we should be coordinating, even if that coordination could be like construed as us competing with each other. I don't think that's true. I think it's better for all third parties in the long term if we all help each other contest as many elections as possible.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And then to kind of piggyback off of that, I think there are ways to support each other that aren't limited to voting. And I mean, this is true of really any political activism, but I imagine all third parties agree on some type of electoral reform, voting reform. And so there are political activist type things that we can do, like petitions, for example, where you get a heck of a lot more signatures if we're combining with the other third parties on that kind of action. So I think those are things that can be done that don't require, as Gavin was saying, these kind of stubborn groups of people from supporting each other in ways that we wouldn't want to, but we can definitely get together on the things that we agree on and make strides, especially outside of the ballot box.
Yeah, I think actually I should clarify a little bit with the question that I sort of meant to ask. Is like I definitely think that everything Gavin said is true. I think if we did that, we would basically be saying, man, I really hate having to hold my nose for, the two big, conglomerates. So let's just all get together and form one really big conglomerate and hold our nose so that we can, not exactly that much better. But I think actually sort of what I meant in particular by a coalition is, and God willing, this would be like it would be if a third party would hopefully have some elected office. But say there was something in like Congress where you could get a number of Democrats and Republicans who let's say that some third party got onto, by God's grace, got onto the House or in the Senate. What I would be suggesting is something more like we would get them together, and then a bunch of the Democrats and Republicans who are, maybe dissatisfied with the current sort of status quo of just the two parties, to kind of come together for some bill or something that would make it easier for then third parties to kind of gain ground. That sort of cooperation on like individual pieces of legislation, which is, I think, that seems proper to the political system, right? Is that there's always going to be some amount of compromise and some amount of working together, right? As opposed to sort of this morphing parties into one. That's not exactly what I had in mind, but I think that's an important distinction to make.
Yeah, well, I like that question. I think that goes to what would be so great about ASP representation in a legislative body would be the fact that it's going to force people to work together on an issue. And maybe, it's great if there's an issue that multiple people already kind of agree on, and then, yeah, you can form a coalition on that idea. But even on stuff that people don't agree on, I mean, like take immigration, for example. Wouldn't it be great if we had several ASP members in Congress that, would swing the vote one way or another? And so either major party would have to kind of court the favor of the ASP. And by the way, the ASP would be in a great position to work across the aisle with people, because our party is not based on these kind of like extreme philosophies. We are uniquely different. And I think we would have a lot of ability to kind of find common ground with people. That's kind of one of our things, right? Common sense, common ground, common good. We would have the ability to find common ground with people. And yeah, electoral reform is just one of those things that I think we would be able to establish common ground on. There are really, pick any of the major hot button issues of the day. I think we could establish common ground on those issues.
Yeah, actually, if you don't mind me jumping in really quick, I know I'm not supposed to be talking too much, but you just reminded me, Philip, of there was actually something I heard of where I believe it may have been J.D. Vance when he was in the Senate, but he's a little bit different than the typical sort of, libertarian, toe the line Republican. And there was a bill, I believe, he was trying to pass, I think it was, where I think it was the Make Birth Free bill. And the idea was to provide government funding towards giving birth, to help make it easier on people who want to give birth. And there was a little bit of pushback, actually, from obviously both sides. From the Democrats, it was a pro-life bill, and they wanted, they would rather fund abortion. They wanted something like that. And they didn't really support that aspect of it. But the Republicans, many of them did not support any sort of government aid or entitlements or help, basically. But at the same time, I believe he was able to get a coalition of people together who, Democrats who maybe they didn't really agree fully with the pro-life aspect of it, but they wanted to help people with government help. And then the Republicans who maybe they weren't super keen on the government help, but they're certainly pro-life. And he actually successfully got that passed, as far as I understand. And I think that's like a wonderful example of exactly what you just said, that we, our political perspective is one where, like, we would have been great in bridging the gap, I think, between both there.
Yeah, and here's why I think the ASP is so well positioned to do that kind of thing. And I use this word a lot, nuance. We're able to appreciate nuance. And I think a lot of that has to do with the Catholic social teaching heritage that we're built upon. I'm going to give a little a little shout out to Catholic social teaching. If you're not familiar with Rerum Novarum by Pope Leo XIII back in 1891, this was kind of the seminal document for Catholic social teaching. In it, he gives both a strong condemnation of communism while also a strong defense of workers' rights. This kind of forms the foundation of Catholic social teaching over the past 100-something years, right? From our modern perspective, probably even from the perspective of people at that time, the juxtaposition of those two ideas would have been mind-blowing, right? But he was able to very effectively weave those two ideas together using nuance in support of the truth. Most of the problems we encounter in politics are too complex for an either-or solution. I mentioned immigration earlier and didn't really say anything about it, but immigration is a very complex topic, right? We recognize as a nation that we have the right and the duty to control our borders, but we also recognize that through solidarity and a recognition of human dignity, that we have some responsibility to care for the alien among us, right? I mean, that's a part of our biblical heritage. So that's complex, and there's nuance there, and the ability to bring ideas that are in tension and hold those ideas in tension and not just take the really simple answer of, well, it's either this or this. That ability is completely lacking in our public discourse. And that's something that the American Solidarity Party can bring back to our public discourse, is an appreciation of nuance in service of the truth.
Yeah, the Civil Rights Act, or I guess there are multiple Civil Rights Acts, most of them passed within a few-year period. That was all done because of a cross-partisan issue-based coalition. And sadly, we just don't really see anything like that today. Like, almost every vote is either party line or like essentially party line, and you just see like a few members of one party defecting. And people ask me sort of like, what do you think your vision is for the ASP in your sort of ideal world? And I think like there are a lot of different answers among party members. But I think what I would like to see is something like what the Christian Union Party does in the Netherlands, in that, like, I don't think they've ever gotten more than 10% of the vote in their 20, 30 years of history of contesting elections. But they're pretty similar to us, just in the sense of like ideology and voter base and that kind of thing. Like, I don't think we could ever, become the first place party. Sadly, I wish we could. But what we could do is, if we had a fair electoral system, is like elect a few people to Congress, and then if elections are tight, then we essentially control the balance of power, which has happened in the Netherlands. And you've seen the Christian Union like participate in several governments and say like, hey, you basically need our support to get these things passed, and a lot of them we agree with, so we'll work with you on this, but also we need certain conditions of our own. And they're really leveraging their position, like Phillip said, like sort of being in the middle and seeing the nuance and being able really to talk to both sides and say, like, this is what we're going to get done and this is what we need in return.
Yeah, wonderful. That's a wonderful point, Gavin. If you guys are okay, I'd like to jump. Or did you guys have anything more to say about that? I was going to say, now might be a good time to jump into a question from the audience that we got. I believe, yes, it is by Dark Disciple. The question was, I think we're going to pull it up here. If we care about political efficiency, why wouldn't we just forget the whole electoral progress and engage in special interest lobbying? This way, it's possible to continue obtaining consecutive power acquisitions outside of election year. So yeah, I guess what do you guys think about that?
I mean, you could make a lot of moral arguments, but honestly, my first question is, what special interest supports what we care about?
Yeah, and I'll jump on that with also my maybe retort to that question, which is, we don't have one special interest. We have, what we want to see is not just a single special interest in our political activism. If that were the case, I would say, yeah, maybe a political party is not the right idea. If we were just the pro-life party, then yeah, maybe pro-life activism would be the way that we need to go. Or if we just cared about like immigration reform, then that would be what we kind of go all in on. But that's not it. What we are interested in is integrating Christian ethics, Catholic social teaching into the American political ethos. That's not something that you can accomplish with just kind of one narrow special interest. So I would say, although political activism in particular special interests is very important, that's not the overall goal of the ASP the way I understand it. We're trying to do something more holistic, which is to kind of like fix American politics.
Yeah, it's not like we have like super radical opinions on any one issue. It's really the combination of issues and how do we like have a holistic and consistent view of protecting life and protecting people.
Yeah, okay, that's an excellent point. So like the pro-life issue, one of the key things that distinguishes our pro-life stance from, I guess, what used to be the Republican pro-life stance is that we are not just interested in legislating against abortion. That's important. That's really a key element of the advocacy. We're also interested in establishing a pro-life culture, and that is everything from support for pregnant mothers in crisis pregnancies. I mean, it touches even things like bail reform to make sure that people who are the subject of an unjust criminal justice system aren't absent from taking care of their kids. So like, it's not just one special interest. When we talk about a consistent life ethic, it really is everything. And so yes, we should be active. We should be politically active outside of the electoral process as well. But what the ASP really brings to the table is a holistic, consistent life ethic in politics.
Yeah, there's definitely an appeal there, not just in terms, what I mean is there's importance there in terms of like we really want to shape American political discourse in the image of, to a certain extent, a little bit more in the image of Christian democracy. We believe many different things. You don't just believe one thing very strongly, and we'd like to see that sort of the package deal, I guess, sort of succeed. And the fact that there is that coherent, ideology, the coherent belief system. I don't actually like to use the word ideology there, but whatever, just that coherent system of thought. And as Phillip said, with the nuance there of being able to sort of build off of a more foundational political philosophy that's coherent, that's able to, weave through those, nuances without just like radically just choosing one principle, like just like freedom or just equality or just whatever, and just like blowing it up. I mean, I think that's important in that, yeah, I would agree that like a party, being not just like lobbying with one thing or another thing, but just like being a party that has a presence that can, even if we don't take over exactly, as Gavin may say, even if we never get more than 10% of the votes, shaping the Republicans and the Democrats to like, I mean, just to compete with each other to see who could be the most like us to appeal to our voters the most, right? That itself is beneficial. Now, we'd like to just go over one more question from the audience that we got. We might actually have more, but this one that just came up is by Michelle Vincent Corbeau, I believe, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Asks, I only recently discovered about the ASP. Are there any readings or books or just anything, presumably anything to read up on that the ASP would recommend, or any of you guys would recommend, to learn more about Christian democracy and distributism?
I'll touch on distributism first. It's actually something I myself am still learning about. I have really come to appreciate distributism as an alternative to socialism and capitalism. Again, these either ors that we have in our political discourse. I am intending to read some of the writings of our other ASP members who know a lot more about distributism than I do. Thomas Stork gave a presentation yesterday on distributism, which was very good. I haven't gotten to watch it yet, but John Madal, if I'm saying that name right, has given talks on distributism. He gave one on Friday. those would be good places to start. And then also both of them have written books on distributism that I plan to devour when I get the chance. Christian democracy. First, I'll preface this by saying I'm Catholic, so my understanding of Christian democracy is primarily from a Catholic point of view, and so Catholic social teaching, as the broad teaching, is kind of where I know most of my Christian democracy from. But I know it's not just Catholics, so there is a wider appeal there. First point of reference I would recommend is the American Solidarity Party blog. Has been putting together essays on the key the principles of the ASP platform, and there are 7 that are essentially in line with the 7 pillars of Catholic social teaching. So those essays would be a great place to start. I know we're in the process of finishing all 7 of them, but that's a good place to start. And then I think by reading those, it will kind of springboard you into other references that you can use. But let's hear what you guys have to say about that.
Yeah, I think the question of like finding what we believe as a party is a little bit easier because we have resources like the blog, but then you also, like with Distributism by G.K. Chesterton, wrote a lot of stuff about that. I think The Outline of Sanity is his main book where he details economics, although I haven't read most of it. I've read like very little parts of it. But the problem that I've ran into is when I was trying to learn more about the history of the Christian democratic movement, and that has been like surprisingly difficult for me. I'll be reading Wikipedia and I'll say, okay, let's try and click this reference and learn more about it. And like, oh, it's in German. Okay. I'm not really sure what to do about that. And I think like even just the scholarly research in the English language has not really like covered that much about Christian democracy. Unfortunately, I was able to find this really good article. I don't know what it's called off the top of my head, but I could probably find it again. But other than that, I think like it's sort of a theoretical project of mine that eventually I'll try to broach this topic, but I think that'd really have to be like focusing on one particular era of one particular party at a time, and then like going deep into tons of historical rabbit holes. But yeah, I will say that I'm sorry, this is less of an answer and more of a rant about like personal things that have frustrated me in the past, but it just seems like there is sort of a gap in scholarly research on this in English. I'm not sure, but I think you can at least start with, like I said, the party blog, and then people like G.K. Chesterton. Maybe you can read biographies of more famous Christian Democrats, people like Konrad Adenauer, the first Christian Democratic Chancellor of Germany, for instance.
Yeah, and I would say, again, this is coming from my Catholic background. If you are either Catholic or you're not too opposed to Catholicism, there's a lot of writing about Catholic social teaching that is very much in line with general Christian ethics and kind of the key elements of the Solidarity Party. And the reason why, even if you're not Catholic, you shouldn't be afraid to delve into these things is that it's not dogmatic. It's not based on strictly on revelation. It's based on natural law principles, enlightened by revelation. But you could be a secular person with no faith background and find a lot of interest and commonality with the natural law principles, the reason that is used to basically start from and like really broad strokes, if you want the overview, is start from the premise that hopefully everyone can accept, which is all human beings inherently have dignity. If you start from there, you can, through reason, derive pretty much all of the other principles of Christian ethics, Catholic social teaching, and the platform of the American Solidarity Party. So it really has a broad appeal. And that's another reason why I think people shouldn't be afraid of the ability of the American Solidarity Party to gain a hold in a secular society, is that although it is based on Christian principles, these are Christian principles that are pretty universally acceptable to all people. And so there's no reason why it can't appeal to a broad portion of the population.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people, Catholic and non-Catholic, are just like unfamiliar with the fact that the church has taken not just strong, but like very cogent and well-articulated stands on things like workers' rights, which
Yes.
a lot of people are just simply not familiar with.
Right. Yeah, short answer, start with the blog and then go from there.
Yeah, if I could jump in a little bit too, I'd say also I definitely have, I mean, I would say all of that. But then also I started reading this. I can't fully vouch for this because I've only started it, like I said, but a sort of critique of a lot of the sort of modern, at least as a critique of our current political discourse. I tentatively recommend Why Liberalism Failed by Patrick Deneen. He's actually an advisor of the Solidarity Party, and he's big with the so-called post-liberal movement. And a lot of it, he kind of, bases his perspective off of the similar roots, right? Natural law, Catholic social teaching. So I think that there's definitely that, going back to that sort of, even just looking into like studying, if you want to get really deep into the philosophy behind it, studying someone like Thomas Aquinas or Aristotle or any of the scholastic, any of the scholastics would be another great thing to do that I would recommend. But and then we have one more question, unless you guys want to say anything about what I said. We have another question from Christopher Engel. There's an aspect of natural individuation that made the two parties exist organically. Decisions resolve to unity and truth is binary. I'm not sure if that's necessarily a question, but I guess, what do you guys think of that?
I'm not sure if I'm completely understanding it. Maybe I'd have to hear a little bit more about the idea that goes behind that. But I suppose one could argue that for any question, it's unlikely that you're going to end up long term with a political system where there's just one party, because eventually people are going to kind of bifurcate on issues. What I think we have to be careful about, though, is the idea of the truth being binary. I'm not sure if this is what's meant, but if someone wants to say that, well, there are two sides to any story, you hear that kind of aphorism, or that, you've got to see the issue from both sides, so to speak. I think that's a false premise that there's kind of two sides to the truth. If you think of something like a shape, like a square, for example, if you're on a side, you are by definition missing the majority of the shape. You're in a one-dimensional element of a two-dimensional structure, right? So if we are trying to see an issue from both sides, first of all, if we're picking a side, we're wrong, right? If we're trying to see an issue from two sides, then I think we're buying into this premise that there are two sides to the truth, when in reality, there's a nuanced complexity to the truth, but there's one truth. So I don't know. That's my kind of rant on trying to understand that comment.
I'll say there was also a follow-up. Christopher, if you want to provide a little bit more context really quick, you're welcome to, because we will soon have to move on to new questions. But Christopher Engel followed up with, and I'm sorry, by the way, Christopher, if the context for that comment was lost. But if you'd like to provide a little bit more context, please do. But Christopher followed up with like more positive versus falsehood, which I assume he means something like, Christopher says that the individuation is a Jungian idea, like the psychologist Jung.
Okay, sorry, I'm not familiar there.
I wish I was. But just that Christopher, tell me if I'm understanding this, at least in some sense, close to your perspective. It sounds like what you're saying is like with the two-party system, there seems to be just this like, do you mean like more of a rallying against what's false instead of like positively believing in something that's good and true? because I definitely think that there does tend to be a lot of that with the two-party system of, but you guys want to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, something that you see a lot in public discourse is if you, I encounter this in conversations with friends. You know, if you point out something wrong with one of the parties, often the counter is, oh yeah, but these other guys do this terrible thing. So there's this dualism that we set up, which is largely because of the two-party system, where it's like, well, oh, if you disagree with the Republicans, you must love the Democrats, which is absurd. And so a lot of our public discourse is thwarted by the two-party system, where we kind of fall into these camps, very tribally fall into these two camps. It's binary. Every issue is binary. It's either this or this. And if you don't agree with A, you must agree with B. That's really damaging to our understanding of the truth and our ability to solve complex problems.
All right, the second, and I think this will be the last audience question, not audience question, not the last audience question period, but we are going to pause. So don't be alarmed if you've asked a question and this is the last one we're covering right now. We're going to get through a few more that we've discussed in advance, but please keep them coming. But yeah, this question we have from Laura Norman. What effect would result if 1,000 ASP members sought and obtained local political office?
Yeah, that would be pretty awesome. I think that would be, I don't know, maybe going back to the history akin to what you saw with the Greenbacks and the Populists in the late 1800s, where there was an influx of these minor parties in Congress, and people started really paying attention to these ideas that were being neglected for a long time. So just from that perspective, yeah, that would be very influential, obviously. Also, I think it would bring the platform and the viability of the ASP to national attention. So I think the impact of ASP participation in local elections cannot be overstated. And again, it may not, it's probably not going to be U.S. Congress to begin with. Maybe it's state legislature. Maybe it's very, very local offices, but it's going to be gradual, but I think the effect could be profound. So, yeah.
So if you look at the Green Party Wikipedia page, like most parties, it has like all the seats in Congress, then the seats in state legislative chambers. But there's a funny little thing going on here where it says other elected officials, 143 out of 519,682. Now, knowing the nature of Wikipedia, I don't think that will last long, because there is no other Wikipedia like party info box in the United States referencing these like 500,000 elected offices. I'm not really sure how you get to that number. They provided the source, but anyhow, that's not totally relevant other than the fact that like they have 143, and what are they doing with that? I'm not entirely sure. Probably some good stuff. But yeah, I'm not really sure where to start answering this question, also because like what counts as a local office? Like I've heard people like colloquially call something like house races local races, even though like it's a federal office. But I think I just don't really have a sense of like what 100 or what 1,000 local offices would really mean, both in relation to like what they're doing, because it depends on what they're doing, but also how many that is proportionally. But I think you could, yeah, there is the ideological aspect where you see like towns sometimes pass resolutions like saying like we think abortion is bad or we think abortion is good, but there's ultimately not that much you can do about that. So I think getting us elected locally is more about proving our competence at governing rather than getting into any of these like super deep ideological issues. I think, seeing it also depends on each community. What are the issues that are facing your community? They're often highly specific and not things that people who live elsewhere would think about. So it's like, how can we adapt our beliefs into solving these various different problems and then prove our competence and governance at the local level.
Here's what I imagine this, and I think this is pretty realistic. What I imagine is even a few local offices go to ASP members, and what you start to see is gradually news coverage of, hey, here's this weird party that won this election. Let's hear a little bit more about them. Nobody's heard about them before, but here they won. And then what you might start hearing is, okay, this issue that was contentious between Republicans and Democrats, guess what? The ASP helped kind of broker a negotiation on this because they were able to grapple with the nuance and the complexity of the situation. That's interesting. Let's look into these guys more. Hey, maybe people start seeing that, yeah, the ASP makes a lot of sense. And even if we don't agree with all of their policies, they're able to help bridge the gap between Republicans and Democrats and overcome some complex issues. So I think, and there are local issues at stake where there's a lot of headbutting between Republicans and Democrats. So, I mean, I've previously given examples of kind of state or federal far-reaching things like immigration and abortion, things like that. But if you also look at like local issues like bail reform, the criminal justice system, policing, and reform of the kind of lack of respect for police and police brutality going on at the same time. Like these are things that are very important local issues where the ASP has a lot to add to the conversation, and I think could help bridge the gap. So you see ASP members in local office starting to address these problems in productive ways. That's going to catch people's attention.
Yeah, I found conflicting information, but it seems like there's roughly around, so we'll just say, let's say there's like 20,000 like cities, or at least like small towns like scattered throughout America, like cities, towns, villages, things, I guess things like that. And let's say we get 1,000 seats. So that's like 1/20th of like every city in the country or every town would have like an ASP person like involved in some way. That I think is pretty powerful. They could, yeah, have a lot of impact.
I think we could also like really run hard on zoning issues, because a lot of cities you have either like a bipartisan consensus on maintaining car-centric infrastructure, or there's like only one party that can win in the city, and they just happen to like, support this like car-centric status quo. So I think like that's something that our platform addresses, but also that a lot of people who aren't necessarily like Christian Democrats would agree with us on. So I think like that's something where we could like run on the local level and have a really big impact.
Yeah, hey, that point that you just brought up reminds me of the talk I was listening to yesterday with Chuck Marone, I think if I'm saying his name correctly, from the organization Strong Towns, which was a fantastic. I really enjoyed that discussion, so I recommend people check that out too. About local governance, about zoning, kind of city infrastructure, things like that. So check that out.
Yeah, awesome, guys. So we've talked a lot, obviously, about the merits of third parties, but I figured we could deal with a very common objection that that at least I've heard, which is why sometimes it's in the case of like it's a wasted vote, or like that's what people say, but really, like, why should we bother? I guess wasting time, right? I tried to start a third party when you can just reform an existing party. Usually this is proposed as like through a caucus. And the idea is that way we wouldn't take away votes with the spoiler effect, but we could still work through our goals and stay politically united through like the caucus. The claim is then that if we have this caucus, that'll prevent us from just kind of dissipating and not being able to be organized within just a larger party. But at the same time, we can sort of we could choose the least evil option so we can at least do some good even while we're trying to take over. And yeah, I guess, aren't we just removing people from the chance at taking, you know, big positions of power to then open it up to third parties later? Like how we talked about a coalition of Democrats and Republicans who are largely dissatisfied, but they still, you know, picked what they see to be the lesser evil. We talked about, you know, the hope of changing the voting system through like a coalition of them. This objection could say just that and say, well, why don't, you know, you wouldn't make that possible. You'd take all the people that would agree with you, that would be the most likely to want to open it up to other third parties, and take them out of the major parties, so we wouldn't have any positions of power. So I guess, yeah, that's kind of a lot, but and it also, it might be connected with the notion that, you know, we're just so similar to X party, so we should caucus it within them. And usually I've heard this particularly from Republicans. I don't know if I mean, I definitely run with a different crowd, I guess, of people, but yeah, I guess in addition to that is so why not just be the American Solidarity Caucus? And then, are we different enough from the two major that you know, or in other words, what do our differences from the two major parties have to contribute to, like, maybe we shouldn't just be a caucus?
I think there are like three things going on here. The first is like, the obvious question is, which party should we attempt to do like quote unquote entryism in? And I don't think our members could all agree on that. So that's the first thing. The second is, we've been talking a lot about the Populist Party and had they had like all these great effects on like workers' rights and labor rights in particular. And that was like a great thing that I don't think we should diminish. But at the same time, look at us 130 years later, we are now in the same situation. We still have these two parties, none of which like are really giving labor the dignity it deserves. And in addition to that, are now like promoting various different like evil things on different topics. So even if the populists did manage to have like a decisive victory on labor in particular, I think this two-party system is still just like not the most democratic way to run things, because now if you get two parties to agree on something that's really bad, that's not like that much harder than getting one party to agree on something that's really bad. Like, we're only one party away from a one-party state. And I think even if we could solve this issue by issue, over the long term, we see that the two-party system has still like not been like the most effective at solving our issues and solving our problems. So I think another thing is like, it's better to want a more sort of pluralistic political environment. And the third reason is just, for me, you know, I could join one of the bigger parties and then fight for my position within that party. I don't think I would get very far. So if I'm fighting this like sort of chaotic uphill battle, do I want to do it for a political party, or do I want to do it for a country? And this only makes sense if like they're equally difficult, but I think in this case it is equally difficult to really get ground in one of the big parties versus make a new party. So I think all else being equal, it's better for a democratic society to have more parties and more options.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love, Gavin, how you mentioned, like, if we wanted to reform a party, which party would we choose? I live in a region where most of my friends would say, obviously, the Republican Party. Because there's this kind of, frankly, weird, ingrained notion for a lot of Christians that the Republican Party is a Christian party. And yeah, maybe there are a couple things that we don't like, but we could kind of easily reform it to be in line with Christian ethics. Yeah, I don't think so. And then on the other side of the spectrum, I think there are many Democrats out there who would say, like, yeah, if we could just kind of, or maybe not anymore, there aren't any like kind of true blue Democrats anymore that would say this, but maybe people with Democratic leanings would say, yeah, if we could just address the abortion issue and be Democrats for life, then we would be kind of addressing the evil of the Democratic Party, and that would solve the problem. I think what people really overlook, though, is that there are a number of issues where both parties have it wrong. And it's really not obvious how you would go after reforming the parties to be really anything close to a semblance of what the gospel teaches. So Some issues with the Democrats, for example. Yes, the abortion issue is a huge one, and I think if we start there, let's look back like 20 years ago. You actually had Democrats who would be running for office saying that I'm personally opposed to abortion, but I don't want to force my beliefs on other people. You don't hear that anymore. Now what you hear is abortion is a fundamental right characterized as women's health, reproductive rights, that has to be defended at all costs. The shift in the Democratic position on abortion to one that's extreme is concerning enough. So also, if you look at congressional and Senate seats, there's less than 5. Like I could count on one hand how many pro-life Democrats exist at the national level. That didn't used to be the case. There's been a concerted campaign to push away from pro-life candidates within the Democratic Party. Okay, that's enough of a problem as it is that would be very difficult to overcome with reforming the Democrats. But if you also look at a lot of the things that have come up now with like the increased comfort with socialism and a brand of socialism that's particularly supportive of human dignity, intolerance of religion, promotion of policies that undermine the family's ability to operate as the kind of first unit of society, so to speak. So there are a lot of problems with the Democratic Party that it wouldn't be obvious where to start. Obviously, the life issue is a big one, but you'd need to go a lot further than that. With the Republican Party, yeah, there's a lot that we would need to work on there when it comes to a consistent life ethic, where it's not just legislating against abortion, but it's also valuing life through all stages. The death penalty has become more and more supported by Republican candidates. That's something that we would have to address. The favoring of corporations over individuals is something that we've seen more and more. The disregard of care for the environment. The really poisonous rhetoric around the issue of immigration and the treatment, the treatment of immigrants in rhetoric as rapists and drug dealers, and the idea that our nation is better off, like this kind of implicit idea that our nation is better off when it remains primarily white. That's something that we're starting to see come up more on the fringes of republicanism. So there are a lot of problems that we would have to address with both parties. And I wonder, is it really worth trying to go through that reform? I feel like that's an even bigger battle than gaining recognition for a party that's already cohesively centered around a consistent life ethic to begin with.
Do you guys see it as possible to, in other words, do we just take from, I mean, specifically I've heard, like, do we just take from the Republicans, or do you think that we could really successfully appeal to, both? I mean, I think as you said, Philip, like, it's interesting. You could talk about abortion, and like social values. And then there's some aspects of like private property. But even in that case, like we love private property clearly more than the Republicans do, because we want more people to have more of it.
Yeah.
But then a lot of the rest is just like not in the Republican Party at all. And it's true that you could say that there's, and I guess in the same way that like private property being a good is recognized by the Republicans, but they do so in a corrupted way. Environmental, protection and, workers' rights is a good that's recognized in the Democrats, but in an improper way as well. And so I think it's just, you could just say that like because we have that coherent belief system that's already there, and it already sort of like, it's already there. It's already in a place that you could point to, instead of just trying to like do this thing where we like just spend 30 years shaping one party to get just like maybe marginally better. We could do that nationwide. We could just start doing that nationwide. So.
Yeah, so here's the problem. Like, abortion is that's a hot button issue. That's a huge issue in this election cycle. It's not a single issue. The right to life touches all of the other issues, which is why it's so important to have a consistent life ethic in your party. Otherwise, your legislation against abortion is going to fall flat. And I mean, we see this a lot in the post-Dobbs era now, where the state legislation against abortion comes with this remarkable backlash. And it's because there's not a holistic approach to the issue that recognizes human dignity in all forms. So even if we treated that issue as kind of the preeminent issue, it's a package deal. It's got to come with that consistent life ethic.
There was a really interesting news article I read a few weeks ago that said poll suggests that Jill Stein could hurt Donald Trump more than Kamala Harris. Before this article came out, even I would say, like, yeah, Jill Stein is essentially a spoiler candidate and only draws from one party in any meaningful way. But, like, that just might not be true. And I think the reality of, like, third parties on the ballot and who they affect is way more complicated than most people think. So if even the Green Party, who is basically like the Democrats on every issue, just more, if we don't know what they're doing, like, how could you possibly predict like what a party like us or the Libertarians could do, which are like syncretic on all these issues? So I think you could say, like, yeah, there is more fear that we're drawing more from Republicans now. Like, that might not even be true, but even if it is, it's very possible that like the next election could be totally different, and like the conditions in that election mean that like more Democrats want to abandon their party. And, you know, even if like even if you think like, okay, either way it's stealing votes, like I think we only steal votes from like parties who deserve to lose, fundamentally, is like the reality of the issue. So yeah, I think I don't really have an issue with us taking votes from the major parties, because I think like we just have a better, you know, political philosophy. Otherwise, I wouldn't be in this party.
Yeah. One thing real quick though to point out, and I heard this sentiment raised previously too in another talk. We do have a very comprehensive platform that addresses the nuance and the complexity of issues. Something we need to be careful about is putting that appreciation of nuance kind of front and center, so that when it comes to our position, like one of the first things you'll see when you look at the ASP website is that we're pro-life. It's possible that that people will see that and kind of write us off immediately as, oh, these guys are just like Republicans. Now, I'm not saying we need to downplay at all our pro-life stance. I think what we need to make sure that we're always communicating is the full picture of what it means to be pro-life, not just anti-abortion legislation, but that whole comprehensive commitment to the respect for human dignity. And I think if we communicate that well, then we attract really a broad support base.
Absolutely. Wonderful, guys. Also, Gavin, that was a bar. Parties that, you know, we steal the most votes from deserve to lose. And I think actually that will factor into the final sort of set of questions I have for you guys about local politics. Before we jump into that, though, I know we've had Colton. I know we've had your comment here on here for a while, but Colton makes a wonderful point. The two big parties can't be reformed. There's way too much money from corporations and special interests to allow change. We forget that still the two main parties are largely driven by the special interest groups and the corporations, and whatever, you know, wealthy actors fund their views. And there is a whole political like machine behind that we would have to fight up against, instead of being able to just be a fresh party that can just appeal to voters and start talking to real people and real voters, and not have to like not just have to like cut through just like people, opinions from people who disagree with you, but like actually have to like deal with a whole financial like machine that's working against you.
Hey, are we going to have some time to get into why it's not wasting your vote to vote for third parties? Because that's a common objection I hear, and I think it'd be good to really, really go after that.
Yeah, I thought I figured that sort of was subsumed with the a lot of the other things we talked about. But
I think so. Yeah,
directly. So why? I mean, that is the big thing that you hear all the time, right? Is you're wasting your vote with voting third party. Like you're not doing anything. You're not actually helping anything. And it might be connected to also some people I've heard from someone like, at the individual scale, your vote means nothing. So why do you care? That sort of thing.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah. So if we have the time, I think the whole notion of the wasted vote is based on a number of fallacies. So I think sometimes it's helpful to kind of enumerate those fallacies so that we can really expose the kind of logical absurdity of it. We talked a lot about this already, that the purpose. So here, I'm gonna enumerate 4 fallacies. I think we've addressed a number of them so far, but it might be helpful just kind of go through that. So first one, the purpose of voting is to win. The second one, we must win at all costs. Third one, my single vote will be the determining factor in the result of the election. And then 4, the dark horse stands no chance. I think we've pretty effectively addressed each of these, but I'll just maybe touch on some areas we haven't. So the purpose of voting is to win. We've already given a number of examples where even without winning, third parties have had a significant influence on politics. And I think what also is really important to remember is that when you vote, you are expressing support for a candidate. There is no box that says against Donald Trump. There's a box that says Kamala Harris. There's a box that says, whatever candidate you're voting for. You are providing support to someone. And that's really important to keep in mind, because what is seen at the end of the day when election results are analyzed is support for candidates. And yeah, if you do the analysis and you look at the exit polls and things like that, you may be able to tease out a little bit of complexity behind what this vote meant. But at the end of the day, voting for a candidate means you support that candidate. So let's put our vote behind who we actually support. So I would say that's number one. There's also this idea of we have to win at all costs. And a lot of times we talked earlier about how in every election, there's always this idea, frankly, promulgated by the major parties, that there will be some cataclysmic disaster if you don't elect their candidate. I mean, we hear this on both sides this time, that if we don't defeat Donald Trump, we are going to landslide into the worst, whatever, XYZ things that are going to be bad. And by the same token, I hear Republicans saying the same thing about Kamala Harris. It's like, no, we have to defeat them, because if we don't, there may never be another election again. And it's like, it's these kind of doomsday predictions of what's going to happen if you don't elect the candidate that are, frankly, the Democrat and Republican parties love those arguments because it brings people out to vote for them. And what it does is prevent us from ever having a principled vote that's going to result in real change. We have to be willing to lose an election to win some reform of the system. Let's see. One of my favorites is this idea that my single vote is going to be the determiner of the election. This is another one that when you're voting for a major party, people will encourage you. A Republican or a Democrat will say, your one vote might be the difference between fascism and freedom, like that kind of thing. But when you vote for a third party, they'll say, it's just one vote. What's that going to do? It's just one vote. And it's like, my one vote counts the same. It's a small amount. It's like, maybe 1/1,000,000th of a percent. My one vote is small, regardless of who I vote for. And so I think what we have to keep in mind is that your vote really counts when it is combined with other votes that go the same way. So I would be willing to stake a lot of money on this claim. I don't know for sure, but I would be willing to bet money that there has never been an election at the state or federal level that has been decided by one vote. That's probably a pretty safe bet, right? It's not one vote. It's not just your vote. It's you and 10,000 other people. And so if you and 10,000 other people is what it's going to take to elect a Republican candidate, why don't you and that 10,000 other people get behind a candidate that you actually support? That's the problem, though, is that the major parties love us to believe that our vote counts when we vote for them, but it doesn't count when we vote for somebody else. All right, and then the final one, the dark horse stands no chance. So we've talked a lot about how there is widespread dissatisfaction with the two-party system. So this idea that we're never going to be able to get popular support behind a candidate other than Republicans or Democrats is absolutely crazy, because if you look at the polling numbers, there's more support for something other than Republican and Democrat than there is for Democrat, or either Republican or Democrat. So that's my really brief treatment of the four most common fallacies that I hear people talk about when they talk about the wasted vote. I think we had covered them pretty well in the discussion so far, but I think it's helpful to just kind of list them out and knock them out one by one.
Also, I think like your vote will be proportionally a greater part of the vote total if you vote for a third party, which right. I will concede isn't the most like convincing like end all be all of voting for a third party. But like if we're talking about like you and 10,000 people, most states just aren't that close. Most states, 10,000 votes to like either Donald Trump or Kamala Harris, like no one's really going to care. And like, even if they did care just a little bit, either way, like, I just don't think like 10,000 votes in favor of either would do anything really to elevate our public discourse or elevate the issues that I care about. Whereas if 10,000 more people voted for Sonsky, that's a pretty big deal.
Yeah, it's not a drop in the bucket when it stands on its own, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, yeah, and then also one thing that I wanted to clarify, and Gavin, you could correct me if I misinterpreted you here, but something you said earlier about like one of the benefits is just having more options, and that's healthier for a republic to have. As like, and you mentioned, you sort of said like there's sort of pluralistic element, where it's not just one party, or as you said, we're just one party away from one party state. Mm-hmm. But I just wanted to emphasize, like, I think you can absolutely agree with that. I think that you absolutely should agree with that, and still want your, sort of perspective to proliferate. I think, like, as I said earlier, like that doesn't mean that, believing in a multi-party state entails that you believe that like vastly different, moral and political ideologies should govern society. That just means that you believe in a multi-party state. As I said, like, God willing, if the Solidarity Party's perspective, with Christian democracy were to, become the norm in American politics, which is, I think, what we're all hoping for, you'd still have a multi-party system there. It would still be good to have a multi-party system there, so that the different sort of specific belief systems and the different, ideas that may exist within the party could still have a voice and could, that's not just concentrated in just one sort of political entity, and then that shuts out all disagreement. So even in that case where we would want our belief system to become, we'd love it if everyone agreed with, the Christian democracy, Catholic social teaching, whatever it may be, but there's still room in a healthy society for disagreement. And I think that's really just fundamentally another advantage that the presence of a third party provides. Did I understand you correctly, Gavin? Yeah. Dr. M. Smith, a Christian, comments, why are third parties kept out of debates if not to sustain the dual-headed uniparty? I think it's a pretty good point. I mean, it's like why don't they ever have, you know, even someone like Jill Stein, or, you know, some of the bigger third parties, like why is it always just at the debate? It's always just Republican and Democrat.
Yeah, so there's the FEC, Federal Election Commission, I forget, FECA, that sets the rules for who gets invited to parties. And you have to be polling at or above 15% at some point prior to the debate to be invited. So there is some it's not completely arbitrary. There is some kind of guidelines behind that. And I don't want to argue that every party out there should have equal voice in debates. I think we're all recognizing that it would be healthy if they did. But the way by which that invitation is determined is a little silly to me. And it's similar with federal campaign finance, which at least at the national level, you have to garner at least 5% of the national popular vote in order to receive a fraction of the public funds for campaigning for the subsequent election. And there's a fundamental problem with both of those ideas. And it's because those numbers are static. So if you look at, well, first I'll say it doesn't really make sense. The idea that you need to publicize and provide a platform for the two major parties, because everyone knows who they are. Everyone knows that they exist. Everyone essentially knows what their platform is. And if they don't, they can go look it up. Like, we all know that the Republicans and Democrats are running for president. That's not news. And they rarely have anything new to say in debates. Americans are craving other voices that have other things to say on these topics. So how do we decide who gets invited? Because, yeah, it doesn't make sense to have I don't know, make up one of those the little parties that really has no real backing, maybe not very serious. But how do you determine which are serious? I think it has to be something a little bit more complicated than how you are currently polling or how you performed at one point in the last election, because what that says is not how popular you are becoming. What it says is how popular you are right now. Why do we need to provide additional campaign money federally to parties that are already popular? We already know about them. What we want to hear is we want to provide a platform for the parties that are up and coming, the parties that are increasing in growth. So what I would love to see is a slightly more complex but significantly more meaningful metric for invitation to campaign, to invitation to debates, and for campaign finance to be what is the rate of growth of a party? If a party could be popular but declining in popularity and still be receiving significant financial funds. That has been true of both Republican and Democrat parties in recent times. Whereas we have the American Solidarity Party that's rapidly growing in numbers, that rate of growth should be considered when it comes to whether we give invitations to debates or to campaign finance. That's kind of my pipe dream, but it's one that I think makes a lot of sense and I would love to see enacted.
Yeah, it's sort of a hard question, and I think like you see this more at the local level of I've been to local candidate forums for things like house races where there are like, maybe 12 people there, and there is only so much each person can say, and it's not so much a debate as it is we ask people like a few questions. But I don't know, I still felt like that was a lot more productive than anything we've been seeing from the presidential candidates in the past like 8 years. And what I liked about the one that I was able to go to in particular was it was like a church, and they invited like people running in the Democratic primary, people running in the Republican Party, and the one independent guy who sadly did not make it onto the ballot. But I just really liked that they gave an opportunity for everybody, no matter their party or how much support they were getting, to be there. And my only real disappointment is that, like, the leading candidate in the Democratic primary and the leading candidate of the Republican primary, the ones who ended up winning, were not there. And I don't know. I don't know if that was ultimately more productive if the people who ended up winning weren't there or not. I'm just not sure.
Yeah, actually, Gavin, you bring up a really good point, though, is that there are debates that are out there other than the nationally televised Republican Democrat debates. So a few years ago, I watched I think during the 2020 election, there was on the internet, this is the great thing about our technological age today, there was a debate among third parties. There was a third party debate. There are these, kind of smaller, more local debates that happen as well. So, yeah, you can find this stuff. It was really fun to watch last year, the ASP primary debate. And I got to hear about a lot of things that you just don't hear about in the nationally televised debates. So it's out there. We have the internet. We're not beholden to CBS,
Yeah, I know that the Free and Equal Elections Foundation sadly did not put us on this year, and I'm not entirely sure what the reasoning was, why behind that. It's probably goes like really deep and is a rabbit hole that you could go into if you wanted, just knowing how third parties are. But yeah, I just wish that we, were able to be at that forum, because even if a lot less people watch it than the Kamala Trump debate, like, there is still a good amount of people watching it. I still watched one of them, so.
All right, we are getting near the end of the time that we have, so I'd like to ask sort of the last sort of big question that I have for you guys, and it's sort of a two-part question, but so it tackles the question of our grassroots campaign at the local level, basically, in regards to the idea of gaining power in the country, gaining seats, gaining positions, and of course supporters through involvement at the local level. The first would be, and so largely this, as far as I understand it, you guys please correct me if I'm wrong, but local level the local level isn't really highly contested currently by the Democrats or the Republicans. It's most people don't really get involved. Voter turnout at the local level is pretty abysmal. And so there's actually room for a highly organized, a group that cares a lot to actually kind of make strong ground at taking over at the local level. So the first question is, if we started doing this, would the other big parties be able to contest us, or would the Solidarity Party's either unique ethos or culture, or our ideas and our belief in, say, community, subsidiarity, a unique emphasis on the cultural and sort of religious values that many people hold very, very dearly, would that give us an edge, as opposed to, say, if like, like you could think of it like this: some Republicans care about some of the social values that we care about, that are important to, very strongly important to many of us, but they often do so weakly, if that. They have error mixed in, and they also, a lot of their big sort of talking point is sort of, it's like off to the side, like they're very much at the national level stuff, or they're very just like small taxes, like in other words, caring about preventing pornography in your children's schools, caring about and strengthening your local community, for instance. The theory is that seems to move our people more than just like caring about local tax policy moves the Republicans, or or something like that. I just use the example with the Republicans. I'm sure you could find something similar with the Democrats, but and this is where I bring the connection with what Gavin said about a party that we're stealing votes from deserves to lose. When we talk about building community and culture, particularly from the values of a Christian perspective, which obviously involve our social values, but it also involves our, economic and material and other political values. When we're talking about that, it seems like you can make a pretty strong case that we have definitely an edge over the Republicans, I think, at the local level, at local issues that would matter to people at the local level. And the fact that we could become organized in a way that, maybe if they tried to organize, then I guess, yeah, the question is, let's talk about our ability to sort of take over at the local level. And do you guys think we have an edge? And do you think that what I proposed could be an edge for us? And if just as one example, and do you guys have any other examples, maybe, if you do believe that we have an edge at the local level? Do you have that you'd like to share? That was a lot, but
no, that's good. I don't know. What do you think, Gavin? I've got some thoughts on it.
I'm not entirely sure. I mean, local government in where I live, or back home, I guess technically I don't live there in the day-to-day anymore. But in Montgomery County, Maryland, is the county has maybe 1 million people, and the county council has districts, but 4 of them are at-large districts, so I think there are only 7 geographic districts. So those are still really big electorates, and it doesn't feel all that local. But at the same time, I don't know, part of me just wants to say I think anybody could do better than Republicans in where I live, just because of the general partisan tilt. But I don't know, I feel like a lot of the people who are voting Republican are just they only really care about lower taxes, and there isn't really this emphasis on sort of community values and that kind of thing. But then I see certain candidates for school board who are doing decently well on, issues of at least using sort of this type of rhetoric, doing better than Republicans are, at least, even if they won't win. So I'm just, I don't know. I think it is the case that there are a lot of regions that could just have this untapped appetite for this, who are voting for one of the bigger of the two parties, well, for the same reason that anybody does in the first place, but even more disaffected people who are saying, okay, well, at least it's harder to do things that are truly evil at the local level, so I'll just vote for these people because they are less bad, and I think that's less objectionable than voting for someone who you think is evil. But at the same time, I think it is just really hard to know, and I think you need to be more involved in your community, but I'm not really even sure how I would do that, just because I think we unfortunately live in an age where we've lost a lot of the sense of community, and it's no doubt easier for you if you live in a small town, but if you live in kind of this sprawling semi-urbanized area, I'm not really sure. I think it involves just talking to your friends and neighbors about what could be improved at the local level and then running on that, because I'm sure that a lot of what they bring up are not things that the big parties are running on.
Yeah, I'm in somewhat of a similar situation, living in the greater Houston area, where it feels like really nothing is small. Even the school district that we're a part of is enormous, and I feel powerless even within the school district. But there are, you mentioned exposure of kids to pornography in schools, for example. That's an issue I'm fired up about, and that's and the overuse of technology in schools in our school district. It's heinous. The extent to which technology is used for not productive purposes, and the kind of implicit need for high schoolers and even middle schoolers to some extent to have smartphones to be able to participate in school life. So that's something that I've recently gotten fired up about. Other parents are kind of on board with that. Even that one, it's gonna be a hard one to make a lot of inroads on, just because of how big of a system we're in. But I think the key thing is to maintain hope. It can be really easy to kind of throw up our hands in despair when we see so many of the things that we're up against in society. And something that has given me a lot of hope is, at the local level, being able to have one-on-one conversations with people where I find out that, oh, you feel the same way about this. I have no idea what your political background is, and that doesn't matter because you and I feel the same way about this issue and we're fired up about it. So let's do something with that. And you can do that easily at the local level because you can make personal connections with people. And so that emphasis on personal connection is something that we can really capitalize on, because personal connections is a fundamental aspect of the Solidarity Party. When you think about the principle of subsidiarity, treating families as the kind of preeminent unit of society, when we look at it from that perspective, that really emphasizes action at the local level. And I think our party has a lot to say about making an influence at the local level. So yes, I definitely think the Solidarity Party has the ability to really make waves at the local level. And we just need to not lose hope. We need to connect with other people face to face, and we need to engage on those things that we're fired up about, and do something about it.
Yeah, and to that point about it's easier to talk about these sort of things, even like with people who you would disagree with nationally, I think is like a testament to how much easier it is to build new coalitions at the local level that just wouldn't be possible nationally, because the issues are both different from national politics, but also so different from the issues just in other communities, where the entire set of issues is different, and I think people vote for entirely different reasons. And I think it's, you know, I'm not sure which causes which, but also less ideologically charged. So I think that opens new opportunities for us at the local level that wouldn't really exist nationally or even at the state level.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think it's even, there's something intuitive about it, you know, just that we are like, we're localists. We believe in subsidiarity. And kind of building off what Phillip said, a lot of these really, really low level, and this connects to what Gavin said earlier about like, what do you really mean by local? Or yeah, what do you mean by local? But a lot of like really, really local positions don't even have like a party affiliation. There is no R or D by someone's name.
Right.
And that especially is just a powerful place where, like, if we know our own, right? So we have our own network of people, so we can be organized. But it's just, and that certainly is an advantage, I think. And we don't even have to like, tell every single person that like, oh, I'm, of the Solidarity Party, like this is my exact view on gay marriage and abortion. And
right.
like that's just not necessary. I mean, just like, exactly. Just like everyone mentioned, like, or everyone as in you guys, like we need to, I mean, just like local issues that, that we can like focus on, like personal connections,
right.
Particularly. And then I guess the final question with this, let's say we are able to sort of take over a lot at I keep using the word take over. I don't, I'm trying to think of a better way of saying that, that isn't maybe quite so ominous.
Gain influence. Yeah.
Influence. Yeah. There's something, I feel like there's something about like, we're going to gain influence too, which could be a little alarming, but, sure. Gain influence. Let's say we are able to gain influence at the local level. Are we then able to use that sort of as a springboard to catapult towards the greater local or the regional, or maybe even one day the national? What do you guys think about that?
Yeah, I think so. And I think a lot of it has to do with, I was mentioning earlier, the example that we can provide of brokering solutions to complex problems because we're able to appreciate the complexity and the nuance of the situation and bring people together. I really do think that the ASP is uniquely positioned to do that kind of thing. And if we demonstrate that at the local level, I think that starts to get attention at higher levels of government.
I think what happened in Mississippi last year was a good example. In 2023, Brandon Presley, a Democrat, like almost won the governorship of Mississippi, like came within 4 points, I think. And his only prior elected experiences was he was the mayor of this ridiculously small town, and then he was elected as like public service commissioner #3 or something. And like you would think that that's just not a prestigious position at all, but a lot of people were like, hey, I know that guy, I like that guy, I voted for that guy, he did a lot of good for my community. So I think he was able to build up more so than other like Democrats in the South who were just like random people because they need to run someone, but he actually had a lot of like connections to the community and was just like a pretty well trusted guy, had a reputation for standing up against a lot of the corruption that was going on in the state government at the time.
Yeah, so basically, in order for our movement to succeed and for us to be able to actually help America, we need to all touch grass more. Not just ourselves, but as a society, I think.
Yeah.
Right, and then we have one, I guess, sort of final question before we close. What does our faith teach us about having hope in grassroots efforts such as these?
So I'm gonna dig into my Christian faith tradition here, and I know the Solidarity Party is not limited to Christianity, not limited to Catholicism. There really is a broad appeal, but I think these examples from our scriptural tradition should speak to people pretty broadly. I've got several good like kind of biblical examples of where there's the necessity of hope. I'll stick to two for the sake of time. Are we kind of limited on time?
We are. I think we're going to wrap up after this. I know we actually have another talk at 6, and we should give enough time to sort of prepare. So
yeah,
maybe let's keep it no more than five minutes. Say
sure. So let me just hit on two examples then. So I think most people are familiar with the parable of the mustard seed. I don't know if you've ever seen a mustard seed. Here, I've got one. I have a bookmark with a mustard seed in it. You probably can't even see it. There's a dot in this triangle here. That's a mustard seed, right? So if you remember, what Christ tells us is that if you have the faith the size of a mustard seed, you'll be able to move mountains. You'll be able to do anything. Anything is possible. A mustard seed is remarkably small. But as he also says in another, in the Gospel of Mark, he talks about the mustard seed growing into the largest of plants, which provides shade to the birds. If we have that faith in a very small movement, we could develop a structure that gives shade and refreshment and refuge to all people. That's ultimately what Jesus is getting at there, is like, have faith in the smallest of efforts, and I'm going to make it successful. I think that's the key thing that we need to remember, is that it's not just us. If we are acting through our faith, we have the living God on our side. That is so much more powerful than any of the worldly powers that we're up against. We need to keep that in mind. So I'm going to give you one other example that I'd like to point out, which is the multiplication of the loaves and the fishes. So when Jesus is preaching to the crowds, and he notices that there's this large crowd, he asks Phillip, my namesake, what are we going to do to feed these people? And Phillip kind of does his calculation, right? He says something like, I don't know, 6 months' wages wouldn't be enough to feed this many people. He wasn't wrong. He was doing a calculation that was a reasonable calculation. The problem is he didn't have faith along with that calculation. Similarly, then Andrew chimes in and says, here's a boy who has 2 fish and 5 loaves, but what are these going to do for so many? So much of the time when I talk to people about the ASP as this grassroots movement, that's really something that we should be fired up about. They kind of give this Phillip and Andrew calculation of, it's just such a small thing. Like, what's that going to possibly accomplish? We by ourselves aren't going to accomplish much, but if we put our faith in Christ, if we put our faith in the goodness of what we are doing, we can make huge things happen. So just keep that in mind. We need to have hope about what we're doing.
Yeah, I often ask myself, like, why am I in a movement that requires like so much hope when I am just like a naturally very pessimistic person? And I think the answer is that in the long term, I think optimism still wins out. Martin Luther King said the moral arc of the universe is long, very long, but it bends towards justice. And I think that's what we're trying to do here, because I think over probably centuries, I think things do improve. But like Dr. King said, that's not because things get better just because of like some idea of progress. It's because people like you and me are putting in the work every single day to do this. And another quote that popped into my head today was from Patrick Henry, who said, you know, remember, at the end of the day, our God is a just God who will raise up friends to fight our battles with us. And I think we just really have to remember that I don't think hope so much is an emotion. I think hope is a deliberate choice. And I think regimes, like actual totalitarian regimes that are far worse than anything we're going through in this country, have been defeated because people simply believed they can, even when, you know, the quote-unquote rational people said there's no way you can do this. They did it. And they, you know, achieved like democracy in their country. So I think it really is like what is possible is only really contingent on what we believe is possible, and we should never forget that.
Thank you, guys. This was a wonderful, wonderful discussion. And thanks to everyone who engaged with us in the comments and who just silently listened. We really appreciate everyone and all of you who listened. This truly was, as I said, a great discussion. And we just wanted to wrap up and let you guys know that there will be a talk from Amar Patel coming at 6. He is the chair of the Illinois Solidarity Party. We'll also be having a talk at 8 today from the Rehumanize Conference. And at 9:30, we'll have our final keynote speaker, who is Dustin Pieper. Thank you, guys.
Hey, thanks. It was a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you.